May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Actually, before we get started, is one of the ushers in the church somewhere? Because I don't think I saw an adult follow the kids into the hall. Thank you, Tom. That would be a little more interesting than I think any of us want on a Sunday morning. I'm wondering if you notice the people who sort of come across your path. If you notice the person maybe at Starbucks who gets your coffee on most mornings, or the person who delivers your newspaper, or perhaps someone who just happens across your path on a fairly regular occasion. Somebody you may know, someone whose name you may never know, but just those people who are sort of part of our life experience and sort of move in and out in various ways. I've had some really interesting people come across my path in my lifetime, most of the time when I was doing a lot of walking or taking public transportation. There was one lady I used to see all the time who every time I passed her, she'd say, "God bless you, dear." You'd arrive at the bus stop, "God bless you, dear." You'd get off the bus, "God bless you, dear." You were getting on the train in the morning, "God bless you, dear," and you were really happy for that blessing, getting on the train in the morning. I have no idea what her name was. She walked in my neighborhood all the time. I'm sure she lived somewhere close. I know she didn't drive because I would see her at the grocery store where we could walk. But if I was having a really bad day, suddenly just ringing down the block, "God bless you, dear." It was just this lovely little reminder that somebody actually noticed I was there. That someone appreciated me as part of their landscape. When I lived in Toledo, I lived in a whole neighborhood full of interesting characters. Our mailman, Robert, smelled of the incense patchouli. And so if I came into the church, I was like, "Oh, mail's here." The whole church would smell like patchouli. And I found out from one of my parishioners who had dated Robert in high school that he'd smelled like patchouli for 35 years. That this was nothing new. But when Robert would ride his bike from his home to the post office barefoot, with his shoes around his neck, and put on his shoes and deliver the mail. Or David, who was actually one of my parishioners, who was mentally ill, and he would show up at church and say, "Good morning, Pastor," and one sleeve of his jacket would be cut off, but the other sleeve would be fine. His head would be half shaved, but the other half of his head, he'd have regular length hair. And you could have a conversation with David for a little while, but then after a while, those voices that were in his head sort of overtook the conversation that you were having with him one-on-one, and he would sort of drift away. But I'd see David out walking all the time through the neighborhood, down to the library and back. And David's favorite thing in the entire world was the day his check came. Because then instead of walking, he'd get on the bus and he'd go to Pizza Hut. And he would eat a large pepperoni pizza all by himself with a pitcher of beer. It was the highlight of his month. Something he looked forward to more than anything else. But one morning when I was walking to church, as I usually did, it was sort of dark outside. It was an early Sunday morning. And I saw this person coming towards me. And I was a little bit nervous, because you never know who was going to be out in the neighborhood. But from about an entire block away, this voice said to me, "It's me, Pastor. It's David. Don't worry. I've come to walk you to church." And he caught up with me and walked me to church. And he said, "I didn't want you walking in the dark by yourself." Interesting people who come across our lives, some of whom influence us, some of whom we may know their stories. Others, we may never even know their names. A voice, "God bless you, dear." The letter to the Hebrews, while giving us a whole lot of instructions, does say, do not neglect to show hospitality for strangers. You don't know who's coming across your path. You don't know how they may bless you, or perhaps how you may bless them. How something you say or do can completely change someone's day. A terrible day can be turned around by the recognition that somebody cared enough to stop and say, "Hi, how are you?" Don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers. We come in contact with so many people. I think of the other day when I was trying to get down the I-5 and traffic was bumper to bumper. I looked at all kinds of people I will never ever see again, people who crossed my path briefly, people who will have no influence on me, but people who have names and lives and stories and blessings. People we notice, people we don't notice. One thing we know about Jesus is he noticed the unnoticeable. Jesus always paid attention to those everyone else just sort of let slide by. People that weren't seen, the lepers, the poor, the widows, the children, the outcasts for whatever reason. Jesus always put himself right in the middle of life with those that nobody else saw. And that's part of the lesson that our gospel brings to us this morning. In Jesus' time, where you sat at table was extremely important. If you've ever tried to put together table groupings for a wedding, this is like trying to figure that out, but 100 times more important about who might get upset about where they're seated or not seated. Of course, there were no place cards. You were just supposed to know. When you arrived, you'd look around and go, all right, I know that person makes more money than me. He's got a nicer house. This person, not so much. So maybe I sit right about here. But then what if somebody comes that might bump me down? Then I'll be embarrassed. It was a very, very important structure the people in Jesus' time observed and lived by. And the last thing you wanted was to have your seat at the table bumped for somebody else. But you can imagine if Jesus arrives at the banquet, where does he sit first? He sits down at the bottom, down with the rabble. I actually probably think down with the people that were having a better time at the party than those up here who were worried about where they were sitting. Jesus always put himself with the outcasts and the lepers and the lame, with those that nobody saw. And our gospel lesson reminds us, again today, to look, to see, to understand who is around us. Perhaps to pay attention a little bit closer to who happens to cross our path. People whose names we may know or not know. People whose stories we may know or not know. It wasn't very long before I learned that my friend David, who walked me to church, had been a high school teacher, and he had been married, and he had had a very successful career. And then when he was about 32 years old, he was stricken with schizophrenia that was uncontrollable, and ended up divorced and in a group home, and had completely lost his life. And those few interactions that he had with us on Sunday morning were one of the things that rooted him in his life. One of the places where he was a little more normal. One of the places where people looked at him and said, "Good morning, David. How are you?" Instead of letting him pass them by on the street with not a word or an acknowledgement. Just that weird guy who shaves his head. We see these people all the time. And I think our lesson, one of the lessons in today's gospel, is to encourage us to see them, to look, to keep our eyes open. Because God may be speaking to us through those people. God may be inviting us to pay attention to someone who has a gift to give us, or we have a gift to give. We have the opportunity to make a change in someone's life. Or perhaps we have the opportunity to be open to change in our own. So pay attention to those who cross your path. Pay attention to those that you might usually look aside from or ignore. Because you never know when out of the blue somebody may say, "God bless you, dear." Amen.